Hello, hello. Welcome to Reimagining Japan from Imperial Warmonger to Geisha Ally, presented by Cole Shazinski. Now, before we delve too deep into my subject and presentation, I'd like to thank Armando Estrada for helping me create this title. He was very, very helpful with his feedback. Additionally, I'd like to thank Professor Kim for helping me at the start of this research project and by giving me America's Geisha Ally and Embracing Defeat. Lastly, I'd like to thank you, Professor Schatz, for allowing me to be very creative with this project and for allowing free reign as long as there were primary sources. So I very much appreciate that. So let's get into some context. The war in Scap occupation. What led to the US occupying Japan? Well, essentially the events of World War II. And to simplify it, Japan declared war on the US, and the US eventually defeated Japan, forcing them into a unconditional surrender, which led to a large number of Americans being stationed in Japan. Now, what were the hopes for the SCAP occupation of Japan, which SCAP stands for Supreme Command of, or Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers? Firstly, the Americans began to dismantle the military and wartime government. They seized all weapons and munitions and dismantled the wartime factories. Essentially, if America had left after doing so, they ensured that Japan would not be able to go to war within 10 years. So it would take a long time to remilitarize. Additionally, the US also dissolved the War Diet, which the Diet is essentially Japan's version of the American Congress. And the Americans had hoped to replace the previous fascist imperial government with a more democratic and liberal one. Additionally, the Americans forced Emperor Hirohito to revoke his divine lineage because Japanese emperors had been proclaimed as the descendants of Amaterasu, who is the Japanese sun goddess in Shintoism. And how did the wartime propaganda affect the Japanese? And how did it affect the occupation for SCAP? We'll get into it, but essentially, the wartime propaganda created a lasting negative impact that would almost seem irreversible, and the Americans had a hard time re-imaging the Japanese people, and that is what I'm arguing about. And on the right here, we see the SCAP commander, General MacArthur, who served for the Americans as the commander of the Pacific Theater. So, what am I presenting? The United States had created a negative perception of the Japanese for the American people, but now the Japanese people had surrendered and the threat of communism was on the rise. The American government needed to re-image the Japanese people in order for the American people to accept them. The question remains, how did the US re-image the Japanese people? On the right here, we see a image of American wartime propaganda. We see the Imperial Japanese flag, but instead of a sun, it's a depiction of a very dehumanized Japanese soldier being beaten and punched by the American labor force. So we see the idea of how the common American perceived the Japanese people as lesser or not really as human as Americans were. And this begins to change, and we'll get to see how the Americans began to re-image Japan. Now, why is this topic significant? Firstly, I want to mention about how in most history classes, especially through my education of high school and college, whenever you discuss a war, you rarely discuss the aftermaths, with the sole exception being the First World War, as the First World War led to, well, the Second World War. And I think it's important to distinguish and to really look into how a nation is affected from the consequences of war and how it persists afterwards, or what happens to the people in general. So that is why I picked this topic, and that is why I think this project is significant. It's at least significant to me, and I hope it's significant to you. Now, let's cover the historiography. So, John Dower wrote Embracing Defeat, and Naoko Shibusawa wrote America's Geisha Ally. Both of these sources I got from Professor Kim, and both of these sources cover much of the same material, many of the same primary sources. However, they have different perspectives in some of their subcategories. They both cover Our Job in Japan, and Dower mentions how it's very racialized, or at least it racializes the Japanese people. And Shibusawa shows how Americans are beginning to create a not as negative image of the Japanese people, but it still shows how the film Our Job in Japan is, well, racializing the Japanese people and not exactly a 100% positive light. And we also see how women and children are presented. John Dower shows how women were forced or had to resort to becoming comfort women because of the economic collapse of Japan, and how children began to mock or role play as these parents and other adults around them, as they displayed what would be essentially like family play games. And John Dower shows us how horrific it is. Additionally, they both present how Japan is depicted as an immature and childlike nation, especially from records of MacArthur. And Shibusawa also shows how women are not as strictly depicted as sexual comfort women, but as perfect women, traditional, and more appealing than American women, and also how children are seen as innocent and curious. Now, Laura Hines, revisiting America's occupation of Japan, references some of John Dower's work a little bit, and also she focuses specifically on the difference between Japan and Germany, kind of correlates those American occupations to the American presence in the Middle East, and she describes how the American identity plays a major role, and we get to see this in how the Americans believe that Japan is childlike or immature, and that the Americans have an identity of a father figure or a role model. Laura Hine also presents how Japan is depicted as an imperial venture and is kind of the format for how to create a democracy in Asia. Lastly, Millie McAndrew, who wrote Beauty, Soft Power, and the Politics of Womanhood During the U.S. Occupation of Japan, 1945 to 1952, described how Western societal norms played a major role in Japan, and Miss Nippon is one person who was affected by these Western societal norms, who assimilated to American culture. She was presented on a show called The Stars and Stripes, where she was depicted as the Japanese version of Miss America, except rather than displaying Japanese culture, she was seen wearing Western makeup and American clothing, and was depicted as a Western assimilated Japanese woman. And McAndrew also shows us how the role of culture played a major role in how Japan is being re-imaged through women. America's preconceived notions. The early GI experience filled with distrust, and we see this with the early wartime propaganda as it had a negative impact. As we saw earlier in Image, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of images similar or worse than that. There are even wartime propaganda created by the Americans depicting the Japanese people as insect-like or as diseases. Oftentimes, more than not, though, they're depicted more as barbarians that would come and steal women or commit other violent acts. And this created a very negative impact for the Americans, especially for those that served in the Pacific War and would later be stationed in Japan as part of the occupation force. And this kind of resulted in a lot of violence against the Japanese. One major case is the incident with Private First Class Joseph Hicksaw, who was quoted saying, "Let's get him," when he rushed at three Japanese in a public setting with a knife and stabbed and killed two of them. The fellow soldiers with him did not prevent him from doing this and only intervened as soon as the knife had actually, well, killed someone. So it was too late for those Japanese people. And this became a major issue back home in the United States. And as we see, the negative image is still portrayed, and that newspapers aren't concerned about the deaths of two Japanese people, but rather that an American is being charged and that Americans are urging for the president to pardon him or for the courts to give a less harsh punishment. And we get to see how these newspapers began to sympathize with this man, stating how he was just another American that had to be sent to war and experience all these atrocities. And they definitely don't depict a positive light on the Japanese people. In fact, they rarely mention the deaths of these two Japanese people and primarily focus on, well, getting justice in the favor of Joseph Hicksaw. And prior to Americans entering Japan, they had to watch a propaganda film, Our Job in Japan, which is the Japanese counterpart to Our Job in Germany. And in this film, all Americans that were stationed there, military or not, had to watch this film by the US Army. And essentially, this film tries to get rid of racist notions by depicting Japanese as people that have the same brains as us, and that the real problem is that Japanese suffer from a condition called follow the leader. And the film goes on to say, hey, these Japanese people aren't responsible for themselves. It's really the upper echelons of their society and government and religion. And the film goes on to blame Shintoism and begins to demonize it and pins blame on Amaterasu as a goddess who had made the world for Japan, and that the Japanese were made to set out and conquer it, and that the leaders were also to be held responsible. And we see that very few crimes against Japanese government were actually sent to court or processed for justice or anything like that. We see that many were pardoned in hopes of creating a Japan that would cooperate with the US occupation. And we first begin to see how Japan is re-imaged through the use of children. The first encounters of many GIs were from curious children, in which many wanted to approach the Americans, whereas older Japanese people stayed in their homes hiding and were wary of the Americans, but the children were more curious about the soldiers that were there and began to approach. And eventually, the Americans began to fraternize with these children by handing out candy. And many of these children began to play with these Americans. And essentially, this becomes one of the first public incidences of Americans having friendly relations with Japanese people. And we see how this progresses into many GIs supporting the orphans in the orphanages of Japan as the rise of orphans increased after the war due to the economic situation and, well, the collapse of the military and the Japanese government as a whole. And we see Japan in a crisis, and we see American soldiers stepping up with their own paychecks to support these children without homes. Over $500,000 in American dollars in the 1940s, 1950s were given to charities in Korea and Japan, much of which went to Japan. And we see that a single cavalry division, known as the 1st Cavalry Division, aided 21 orphanages alone. And if you look at this picture on the right, we see Sergeant Hugh O'Reilly from the Bronx as he's being welcomed from the orphans in Japan. And his story is that he served in Korea after serving time in the occupation, and he still sent money over while in Korea to support these orphans. So we see a very paternal-like image of Americans and a very childlike image of the Japanese people. And this begins to develop into a very early on relationship between America and Japan, which leads us to our next part, questionable results, in which Japan as a whole begins to be depicted as, well, children. And they were seen as immature and unable to really be independent and walk this world alone. They needed their handheld. And MacArthur was even quoted saying that the Japanese were boys of the age of 12, showing how this began to create a very discriminatory image of the Japanese people. However, this is the first image, a transitionary period from being depicted as barbaric and imperial warmongers to innocent children. And this is one of the first steps. Next, we begin to see how women play a crucial role in the re-imaging of Japan, more so than children. Baby sans is a term that comes from the expression, hey there, baby. And san is a title of respect in the Japanese language. And this kind of became a new female identity. Many of these baby sans were comfort women. However, not all of them. Many were women that sought relations with Americans, hoping for financial stability and, well, to be able to have a life outside of being a prostitute. And we see how GI fraternization begins to increase. However, many of these baby sans were were heavily sexualized, and they became the ire of white women, ironically, because they were seen as more traditional, as previously stated in the historiography, and that they were more appealing to American men than women back home. Now, with the increase of GI fraternization, we also see an increase of children being born. And by the end of SCAP occupation, over thousands of children were born fatherless from Americans, and many of which were sent to orphanages. Many stayed in single parent households, and this became a major problem, and the US government had to eventually step in. And this also became a problem for the Japanese people culturally. However, this also shows us how Americans began to forget the wartime imagery of the Japanese people and began to accept Japanese people as people that could be in friendly relations with, whether it just be comfort women or possibly girlfriends or wives. And we see a lot of this happening in Japan. And back home, we see how Japanese women are being sexualized and romanticized, which is depicting Japan in a better light than the wartime propaganda. And the US government was even using women as a propaganda for themselves. And we get to see an image on the right by Bill Hume in his book, The Hume Slant on Japan, where Japanese women are depicted often with doll-like features, even in Western clothing most of the time. And we see how, in much of these illustrations, how they're trying to portray themselves in a better light for American soldiers. So, did the United States succeed in their goal of creating a new image of Japan? I would argue, yeah, they did. Because they're no longer being racially discriminated against for things that happened during the war or what Americans had believed that the Japanese people were like previously. We see the first instance with Our Job in Japan, which created a hesitancy between the Japanese and Americans, but there was no longer a common feeling of disdain for Japan. It began to change with that. And we eventually see how children played a major role in how Americans saw themselves as a paternal like figure and wanted to provide aid for these children. And Japan as a whole was depicted as a child itself, and that Americans back home believed it was their duty to, well, provide for Japan and to guide its course, essentially, have Japan walk in the United States' step. And we also see this with women and how women played a crucial role in creating a new image by appearing as comfort women being sexualized and women being more feminine. Like in the earlier historiography, as mentioned, Miss Nippon was a woman of Japanese descent who went on to American television and was seen as Western. And this began to change Japan's culture as a whole as it began to westernize and began to be more appealing to the American people. And in an interview with my grandfather, Jerry Shizinski, who was stationed after the occupation of Japan, he stated that the Japanese people were just like anyone else, if not nicer, and that they were very polite. He said that the only thing weird about Japan was probably the food, because, well, it's not American cuisine, right? And we see with this how newer generations entering Japan, being stationed there, are forgetting the wartime imagery and are not scarred by actually fighting in the war. And we see how this reflects back home for Americans, as Japan is just any other country just like America. In fact, probably even better because they've turned to democracy and had followed somewhat in the United States' step in becoming democratic and even westernized a little bit. And we also see how the Japanese reacted to American occupation, with records from MacArthur stating how he was showered in gifts constantly and how many of the Japanese people appreciated what he was doing in the country. So that's the end of my project. I hope you enjoyed. Here are some of my sources, and I hope you have a good time listening to your other projects and doing grading and whatnot. Thank you for your time.